Chapter 1. The carriage wheel sank into a slurry of gray mud with a sound like a wet gasp, jolting Elias Thorne forward against the leather upholstery. He did not wait for the driver to descend. He stepped out into the damp air of the Lakeside valley, his polished boots immediately surrendering to the mire. He did not look at the mud. Instead, his gaze locked onto the silhouette of Willowmere, a skeletal remains of a manor that seemed to be folding into itself under the weight of a century of neglect. He crossed the porch with a measured stride, his breath hitching as he reached the railing. Without thinking, Elias extended his index finger and traced a hard, straight line through the thick layer of grit and dead insects coating the mahogany. The friction was grounding, the line was absolute. In a world of sagging eaves and rotting timber, the line was the only thing that remained true. He stood there for a moment, the silence of the estate pressing against his ears, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the lake hitting the shoreline. From his portfolio, he withdrew the blueprints. They were masterpieces of precision, inked in a deep, unwavering black on heavy vellum, every angle calculated to the millimeter. He held the papers up, aligning the edge of the drawing with the horizon of the east wing. The discrepancy was a physical blow. Where the blueprint demanded a sharp, perpendicular rise, the actual stone leaned at a nauseating 5-degree tilt. The roofline didn't just sag, it billowed like a dying lung. Elias felt a sudden, sharp spike of heat climb his neck, a constriction in his chest that mirrored the rigidity of the projects that had cost him his reputation in London. The house was not merely decaying, it was lying to him. He pushed through the front doors, the iron hinges screaming in a pitch that set his teeth on edge. The foyer was a cavern of gray light and floating motes. He set his transit level on the floor, attempting to map the primary axis of the hall, but the instrument betrayed him. The floorboards had buckled into a series of gentle, undulating waves, rendering his measurements useless. He tried to shut the heavy oak door behind him to block the wind, but the frame had shifted. The door stopped 2 inches short of the latch, leaving a gap that allowed a sliver of the gray afternoon to bleed into the room. As he leaned in to inspect the hinge, a scent hit him. Beneath the expected smell of damp cedar and the alkaline tang of old plaster, there was something aggressive and cloying. It was a heavy, honeyed sweetness. Night-blooming night bloom scent, perhaps, or some mutated variant of a tropical vine. The smell didn't drift in from the gardens. It seemed to be exhaled by the very walls, pulsing from the gaps in the wainscoting as if the house were breathing through a floral mask. It was a scent of misplaced vitality, an organic intrusion into a space that should have been sterile in its death. Elias moved toward the center of the room, where the main supporting pillar stood. He stopped abruptly. A hairline fracture ran from the capital down to the plinth, jagged and deep. He stepped closer, his finger hovering just millimeters from the crack. He didn't touch it, he simply calculated. He visualized the load-bearing vectors, the distribution of weight from the upper galleries, and the inevitable failure of the limestone. The math was cold and absolute. The pillar was no longer supporting the house, it was merely delaying the inevitable. Willowmere was a mathematical disaster, a structure that had forgotten the laws of gravity. He retreated to the terrace, desperate for the clarity of open air. The stone terrace, once a triumph of Georgian symmetry, was now a battlefield. Vines, thick woody ropes of ivy, and something darker, more predatory, had scaled the balustrades. He reached out to clear a path, gripping a thick stem to pull it away from the masonry. He tugged, then strained, his knuckles whitening. The vine did not snap. It was not merely clinging to the stone, it was woven into the mortar, threading through the joints with a deliberate geometric intentionality. It looked less like natural growth and more like a living reinforcement, as if the plants had decided to become the architecture where the stone had failed. He stepped off the terrace and wandered toward the perimeter of the estate, his boots clicking on a surface that suddenly shifted from mud to stone. He stopped. Beneath a canopy of weeping willows, a narrow path emerged from the brush. It was paved in crushed slate, the gray shards packed tight and level. There was no moss here, no encroaching weed. The edges were crisp, the surface swept clean. It was a ribbon of order cutting through the chaos of the wild garden, maintained with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive. Elias pulled the 18th century blueprints from his portfolio again, unfolding the large-scale map of the grounds. He scanned the area around the eastern perimeter, his eyes darting between the vellum and the slate path. He traced the original lines of the pleasure gardens and the formal hedges. There was nothing. No path, no walkway, no indication that anyone had ever existed in this quadrant of the estate. The path was a ghost, a structural anomaly that defied the historical record of the house. Following the slate path deeper into the greenery, he came to a small wrought iron gate that guarded a hidden courtyard. The iron was rusted to a deep orange, but the gate post remained sturdy. As he leaned in to examine the hinge, he saw it, a small, fresh carving in the wood of the post. It was a botanical symbol, a stylized leaf intertwined with a circle etched with a precision that rivaled his own drafting tools. The cut was clean, the sap still weeping from the wood in tiny amber beads. Someone had been here. Someone had been altering the geometry of Willowmere, not with blueprints and stone, but with soil and seed, creating a secret architecture that Elias had not authorized and could not yet understand. Chapter 2. The pruning shears snapped shut with a metal-sharp finality that echoed through the hidden courtyard. Amara did not look up as the rhythmic crunch of boots on slate announced an intruder. She focused instead on a dead limb of the climbing hydrangea, slicing through the gray wood with surgical precision, removing the decay before it could poison the healthy stem. She felt the vibration of the cut in her wrist, a grounding sensation that anchored her to the damp earth. Then came the voice, clipped and sharp as a razor, cutting through the humid silence of the garden. "Who authorized this?" Elias Thorne demanded. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, his posture as rigid as the blueprints he likely held in his grip. His coat was a charcoal wool that looked suffocatingly heavy for the afternoon heat, and his eyes, narrowed and calculating, were currently scanning the greenery as if it were a structural failure. He didn't look at Amara so much as he looked through her, his gaze fixed on the sprawling trellis that had claimed the eastern wall of the ruins. Amara finally straightened, her fingers stained a deep, loamy brown. She didn't offer a greeting. The air between them was already charged with the friction of two opposing philosophies. "The garden authorizes itself, Mr. Thorne. It follows the logic of the sun and the slope of the land, regardless of what a piece of vellum might dictate." Elias stepped forward, his boots clicking with a precision that felt aggressive. He pointed a gloved finger at the hydrangea, which had woven itself into the limestone mortar of the ruins. "This is an encroachment. From a structural standpoint, the root systems are compromising the integrity of the foundation. You have a biological infestation masquerading as a landscape. The lateral pressure exerted by these vines is creating a shear stress on the masonry that no amount of natural logic can justify. It is an architectural heresy." Amara let out a low, melodic laugh that stayed cold. She stepped toward him, the scent of crushed mint and damp peat clinging to her skin. "You speak of the house as if it were a corpse to be embalmed. Your blueprints are nothing more than the skeleton of a dead man, Mr. Thorne. You wish to freeze Willowmere in a moment of imagined perfection, but the earth doesn't care for your symmetry. It cares for breath. It cares for the way the ivy holds the stones together when the mortar has long since turned to dust." "The ivy is a parasite," Elias countered, his voice tightening. He began to pace the perimeter of the trellis, his finger tracing an imaginary straight line in the air, a habit of mental drafting. "It obscures the light, it traps moisture against the stone, and it creates a visual clutter that destroys the intended proportion of the facade. This trellis, specifically, is an affront. It obscures the primary window of the west wing, ruining the axial alignment of the entire courtyard. It must be excised. Immediately." Amara moved with a suddenness that caught him off guard, stepping directly into his path. She was smaller than him, but she occupied the space with a territorial intensity that stopped him dead. She rubbed her soil-stained palms together, a slow, grinding motion that spoke of a deep, visceral connection to the ground beneath them. "You will not touch this trellis. It was planted by someone who understood that the house is not a monument to be admired, but a living thing that must be sheltered. If you tear this down, you expose the limestone to the wind and the rain. You'll accelerate the collapse you claim to be preventing." Elias looked down at her, his intellectual arrogance flaring. He didn't see a gardener. He saw a variable that needed to be managed, a smudge on a clean drawing. "I am the architect of record for the restoration of this estate. My authority is absolute. Now, step aside, or I shall mark the trellis for demolition myself." He attempted to push past her, not with violence, but with the dismissive confidence of a man used to moving obstacles. He reached out to shove aside a heavy branch of nightbloom scent that blocked his trajectory toward the wall, but Amara reached for the same branch at the same instant. Their hands collided, skin meeting skin in a sudden, jarring impact. The touch was electric. It wasn't the gentle brush of a social greeting, but a sharp, visceral spark that seemed to jump from her calloused palm to his polished skin. The world around them narrowed to that single point of contact. The hostility that had fueled their argument vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Elias froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He had spent years insulating himself behind calculations in cold stone, but the warmth of her hand felt like a breach in his fortifications. For a heartbeat, he forgot the axial alignment, the shear stress, and the structural heresy. He felt only the pulse of another human being, raw and unquantified. Amara pulled away sharply, as if burned. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a trembling hand, her eyes wide and guarded. The melodic quality of her voice had vanished, replaced by a brittle defensive edge. "You think you can map this place, Mr. Thorne. You think if you measure every stone, you own the truth of it. But the garden knows more than the house. It remembers who walked these paths before the ruins became a project. I suggest you learn to listen to the silence before you decide what to destroy." She turned her back on him and walked toward the far end of the courtyard. Her movements hurried, leaving Elias standing alone amidst the scent of night bloom scent and damp earth. He remained motionless, staring at his palm. His obsessive need for control, the very engine that had driven his career and caused its collapse, felt momentarily shattered. He could not calculate the sensation that had just occurred. There was no formula for the way his skin still tingled where she had touched him. He felt exposed, as if the garden had peeled back a layer of his carefully constructed armor. High above, partially obscured by the heavy drape of a willow tree, Zoya Volkov watched the entire exchange through a pair of ivory-handled opera glasses. Her face was a mask of pinched curiosity, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen the collision of hands, the sudden freeze, and the subsequent frantic retreat. In the rigid social hierarchy of the village, such proximity between a gentleman of Thorne's standing and a woman of the soil was more than a curiosity. It was a liability. Zoya lowered the glasses and reached into the pocket of her silk gown, retrieving a small, leather-bound ledger. With a precise, fluttering motion of her wrist, she scribbled a note in a tight, cramped hand. She did not record the beauty of the garden or the tension of the argument. She recorded the duration of the touch and the expression on Elias's face. This was the first entry in a dossier she had begun for Lady Beatrice Sterling, a collection of leverage points designed to ensure the estate was liquidated. As Zoya closed the book with a soft snap, she smiled. The architecture of the house might be crumbling, but the architecture of a scandal was just beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. The ink on the ledger was still wet, a series of rigid columns calculating the cost of seasoned oak beams and iron reinforcements. Elias sat at a trestle table in the foyer, the only piece of furniture that didn't seem to be actively surrendering to the damp. He was tracing the line of a joist in his mind, mentally subtracting the decay from the original structural intent, when the silence of the house was punctured. It was a rhythmic, sharp sound, the staccato tap of a folding fan against a wrist. He did not need to look up to know that the perimeter of his sanctuary had been breached. The sound was a signature, as precise and aggressive as a metronome. When he finally lifted his gaze, Lady Beatrice Sterling stood in the center of the foyer, her presence a jarring contrast to the peeling wallpaper and the scent of wet slate. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered like a beetle's wing, and her expression was one of curated tragedy. She did not wait for an invitation, she simply occupied the space, her eyes sweeping over the exposed laths of the ceiling with a look of profound pity. "My dear Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice theatrical, projecting to the furthest corners of the hollow hall. "I had heard the estate was in a state of decline, but I find myself quite overwhelmed. It is not a house, it is a memento mori. One half expects to find a skeletal remain in every cupboard." Elias felt a sudden, sharp constriction in his chest. His hand flew to his left cufflink, twisting a small gold stud with a frantic precision. He stood slowly, his chair scraping harshly against the grit-covered floor. "Lady Beatrice, I was unaware that Willowmere had become a public gallery for the morbid. To what do I owe this intrusion?" Beatrice did not answer immediately. She began to circle him, her movements slow and predatory, the silk of her skirts hissing against the floor. The fan continued its rhythmic tap-tap-tap-tap against her wrist. Intrusion is such a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as a visitation of mercy. You are a man of ambition, Elias. I remember you in the city, the wonderkind of the new neoclassicism. It would be a tragedy to see that ambition buried under a mountain of rotting timber and ancestral pride. Elias tightened his grip on the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He forced his voice into a clipped, technical monotone, the only shield he possessed. The structural integrity is compromised, yes, but the foundation remains sound. The subsidence is localized. With the correct application of load-bearing reinforcements and a rigorous schedule of masonry repair, the house is entirely salvageable. It is a matter of engineering, not sentiment. Lady Beatrice stopped her pacing. She studied him, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the distance between his current desperation and his former glory. Engineering is a costly mistress, and you, I suspect, are bankrupt in more ways than one. Your reputation in the city is a ruin far more extensive than this house. Who is funding this fantasy, Elias? The ghosts of your forefathers? She reached into a small beaded reticule and withdrew a piece of parchment, unfolding it with a slow, deliberate flourish. I am prepared to offer you a sum that would not only clear your outstanding debts, but provide you with a comfortable residence in London, far from the damp and the smell of failure. A buyout. Clean, immediate, and discreet. You would leave Willowmere to those who can actually afford to erase its stains. Elias stared at the figure written on the paper. The number was staggering. It was a golden handcuff, a way to buy back his social standing and erase the shame of his collapsed projects in a single stroke. For a moment, the logic of the transaction screamed at him. It was the rational choice. It was the precise choice. But as he watched the paper, he smelled it again, that strange, honeyed scent exhaling from the walls, the same scent that had clung to Amara's skin. He thought of the secret courtyard, the botanical carvings that defied every blueprint he had ever studied. To sell the estate was to hand over the mystery to a woman who viewed nature as something to be paved over. He pushed the paper back toward her, his lip curling. Your generosity is as calculated as your timing, Lady Beatrice. However, you mistake my current circumstances for weakness. I intend to restore Willowmere to a standard of perfection that you cannot even conceive of. I will not have it turned into a sterilized monument to your vanity. Beatrice did not look offended. Instead, a thin, cold smile touched her lips. She paused strategically, letting the silence stretch until the air felt heavy. Perfection is a lovely sentiment, but perfection requires time, and time is a luxury you do not possess. She tapped her fan once more, the sound echoing like a gabble. I spent my morning with the county solicitors. It seems your father was a man of many passions, but few payments. There is a forgotten lien on this property, a debt of honor and coin that has lingered in the shadows for 2 decades. Elias froze. The cufflink in his hand felt suddenly cold. That is impossible. The title was clear. The title is a fiction, Beatrice replied softly, her voice now devoid of theatricality and replaced with a sharp, clinical edge. The legal loophole is quite specific. Because the lien remained unpaid, a third party, specifically the holder of the debt, may claim the land if the primary residence remains uninhabitable for a period of 6 consecutive months. It is a clause designed to prevent the decay of the landed gentry's assets. She leaned in closer, the scent of her heavy perfume clashing with the damp earth of the house. The clock began ticking the moment you stepped foot back on this soil, Elias. If you cannot make this house habitable, meaning a roof that does not leak, a hearth that draws, and a structure that passes a magistrate's inspection, by the autumn equinox, the estate is liquidated, and I am the one holding the debt. Elias felt the world tilt. The architectural precision he craved had been turned into a weapon against him. He was no longer merely fighting the rot of the wood or the aggression of the vines. He was fighting a deadline. The house had become a countdown. Lady Beatrice folded her fan with a sharp snap that sounded like a bone breaking. I shall leave you to your calculations, Mr. Thorne. I suggest you start with the roof. It would be a shame to be evicted during a rainstorm. She turned and swept out of the foyer, her emerald skirts vanishing into the gray light of the afternoon. Elias remained standing by the trestle table, his gaze drifting upward. He studied the crumbling ceiling where the plaster hung in jagged sheets like frozen waterfalls. He could see the beams, the sheer stress of the weight above, and for the first time, the mathematical disaster of the house felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was an architect of ruins, and he had exactly 6 months to build a miracle before the walls closed in for good. Chapter 4. The drafting table was a scarred expanse of oak, cluttered with vellum sheets and a brass compass that had seen better decades. Amara moved through the dust-moted silence of the study with a lightness that bordered on the spectral. In her arms she carried a bundle of white lilies and yellow roses, their stems stripped of thorns and bound with a simple piece of twine. She did not simply place them, she arranged them. The lilies were positioned to lean slightly toward the center, while the yellow roses formed a soft, protective perimeter around the ivory petals. To any passing servant, it was a mere gesture of decoration. To someone versed in the silent language of the garden, it was a white flag of truce, a confession that the soil and the stone might find a way to coexist without one strangling the other. Elias entered the room 3 minutes later, the scent of old ink and damp limestone clinging to his coat. He stopped abruptly, his boots clicking once on the floorboards. He did not smile. He did not thank her. Instead, he leaned over the table, his gaze narrowing as he studied the bouquet. He shifted his weight, tracing the perimeter of the arrangement with his index finger, though he never actually touched the petals. He was searching for the symmetry, the golden ratio, or perhaps a geometric progression that would explain why these specific blooms had been chosen. He studied the lilies, then the roses, then back to the lilies, his brow furrowed in a struggle to map the organic chaos onto a grid. "The distribution is irregular," he said, his voice clipped and precise, though he didn't look up. "There is no central axis to the grouping. Why are the roses clustered on the eastern quadrant?" Amara leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her linen apron. She watched the way he fought with the flowers, treating a peace offering like a structural flaw in a blueprint. "Perhaps they simply wanted to lean that way, Mr. Thorne. Plants are not drafting tools. They do not follow a ruler." "Everything follows a rule, Miss Okoro," he replied, finally looking at her. The hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a genuine, almost childlike confusion. "Even the most erratic growth is governed by biological imperatives. I simply cannot find the logic in this particular arrangement." Amara felt a flicker of amusement, a warmth that settled in her chest. She stepped further into the room, the smell of the lilies filling the gap between them. "The logic is not mathematical. It is emotional. The white is for the ceasefire, and the yellow is for the shared ground. It is a conversation, not a calculation." Elias looked back at the flowers. He seemed to be weighing her words against his own internal library of definitions. He didn't acknowledge the sentiment, but he didn't move the bouquet. He reached out and adjusted his cufflink, a habitual twitch of his fingers that signaled a momentary lapse in his armor. "I find it curious," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, "that the garden seems to breathe in tandem with the house. When I stand in the foyer, I can feel the ivy pulling at the masonry. It is as if the estate is a single, respiration-driven organism." Amara moved closer, her voice taking on the low, melodic quality of a secret. "Because it is. The root and the stone are in a constant negotiation. The house provides the skeleton, the trellis, the anchor. The garden provides the skin and the breath. If you try to strip the vines away entirely, you will find the stone beneath has forgotten how to hold itself up. They have spent 20 years learning how to lean on one another. You cannot simply decide that the architecture is the only thing that matters." Elias remained silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the overgrown hedge maze sprawled like a green labyrinth. For a second, the rigid architect seemed to vanish, leaving behind a man who looked profoundly tired. "I have spent my life believing that the only way to save a thing is to make it perfect," he said. "But this house, it defies perfection." "Perfection is a dead thing, Mr. Thorne," Amara replied softly. "Only growth is alive. Their intimacy was brittle, a thin glass bridge spanning a wide chasm, and it was shattered by a movement outside." Amara's gaze shifted toward the window. There, partially obscured by the dense, unpruned foliage of the hedge maze, stood Zoya Volkov. She was a pale smudge against the deep greens, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders as if the air itself were an insult. She wasn't merely strolling, she was stationed. In her hand, she held a small leather-bound notebook, and her eyes were fixed on the study window with a clinical, predatory intensity. Every minute Elias spent in the company of the gardener was being catalogued, timed, and recorded. Amara felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. Zoya was not a neighborly presence, she was a sentinel. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Zoya was the eyes and ears of Lady Beatrice. The estate had ceased to be a sanctuary and had become a panopticon. Every shared look, every lowered voice, and every breach of social decorum was being transcribed into a dossier that would undoubtedly find its way to the Sterling household by nightfall. "Who is that?" Elias asked, noticing the shift in Amara's posture. "A ghost of the village," Amara replied, her voice tightening. one that prefers to watch from the shadows rather than walk in the light. Elias frowned, but the distraction was fleeting. He turned back to the table, his finger tracing a line on a map of the estate's original grounds. "These maps are useless," he admitted. "A stunning concession. They show the gardens as they were in 1810. They don't account for the migration of the soil or the way the creek has shifted the foundation of the east wing. Your knowledge of the current terrain, it is more accurate than any parchment I possess." Amara felt a surge of cautious triumph. "The land changes, Mr. Thorne. If you trust the map more than the mud, you will spend your life walking in circles." They stood there for a few minutes longer, speaking in low, hurried tones about the historical flora of the valley, the ancient oaks that predated the house and the rare ferns that clung to the dampest corners of the cellar. For a brief window of time, the social hierarchy and the looming threat of the equinox vanished. There was only the shared fascination of two people trying to decipher the same riddle from opposite sides of the board. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the study, Amara made her way back toward the garden gate to gather her tools. The light was a bruised purple, the kind of twilight that made the ruins of Willowmere look like a sleeping beast. As she reached the gate, she stopped. Nailed to the weathered wood of the post was a small, cream-colored slip of paper. There was no signature, but the handwriting was a sharp, sloping script that left no room for ambiguity. "The soil of Willowmere is rich, Miss Okoro, but it is a poor place to bury a reputation. Be mindful that improper associations often carry a cost that no amount of gardening can erase." Amara stared at the note, the paper fluttering in the evening breeze. She looked back at the house where a single lamp had been lit in the study. Elias was still there, perhaps still staring at the flowers, unaware that the walls of his sanctuary were already being dismantled, one observation at a time. Chapter 5. Chapter title, The Wabi Sabi Break. The smell of cedar shavings and linseed oil usually acted as a sedative for Elias, but today the workshop felt like a pressure cooker. He stood with his boots planted in the sawdust, his finger tracing a jagged fissure in the primary support beam of the east wing's vestibule. The crack was a violent zigzag, a betrayal of the grain. "It is untenable," Elias said, his voice clipped. "The structural integrity is compromised. I want the beam replaced with a fresh piece of seasoned oak, flush, seamless, and perfectly squared. A new beam is the only logical solution." Hiroshi Tanaka remained leaned against the workbench, watching Elias with a gaze that was unnervingly still. He rotated a small piece of sandpaper in his hand. The workshop was silent save for the ticking of a clock and the muffled cry of a moorhen in the marshes. "And what of the history of this wood?" Hiroshi asked. "This beam has held the weight of this house through a century of storms. It has bent, it has groaned, and it has survived. To replace it is to tell the house that its survival is a mistake." Elias adjusted his cufflink, the silver cold against his wrist. "Survival is not the goal, Mr. Tanaka. Restoration is. A crack is not a story, it is a failure of material." "Is a scar a failure of the skin?" Hiroshi stepped forward. "Does a soldier become less of a man because he carries the mark of a blade? The scar is the evidence of the victory." Elias felt a surge of irritation. He was a man of blueprints and immutable laws. The notion that a flaw could be an asset was offensive. He pointed a rigid finger at the fissure. "This is a structural liability. If I allow a single imperfection to remain in the foundation, the entire project is a lie." Hiroshi sighed and produced a small ceramic pot containing a shimmering resin mixed with powdered gold. "Kintsugi," the carpenter said softly. "We do not hide the break, we illuminate it. We fill the void with gold, making the object more precious because it was broken." "I will not have my house look like a piece of patched pottery," Elias snapped. "You will," Hiroshi replied, his tone absolute, "because I will not cut a new beam. I am a craftsman, Mr. Thorne, not a factory. If you wish for a seamless, soulless box, hire a builder from the city. If you wish to save Willowmere, you will learn to love the break." Elias stared at the gold resin. The loss of control felt like a physical weight. He studied the crack again, and suddenly, the fissure looked like a fault line in his own life. He remembered the great conservatory in London, the breathtaking scale of glass and iron. He remembered the moment the central spine had buckled under a freak snow load. It had been dismissed as an act of God, but he knew it was a result of his own rigidity. He had refused to allow for the organic shift of the earth. The collapse had erased his name from the architectural registers of the city. His breathing shifted into short, jagged gasps. The walls seemed to lean inward, the scent of cedar becoming stifling. Elias stepped back, his heel catching on a pile of shavings, and he slid down the brick wall. He hit the floor with a dull thud, hands clutching his throat, vision narrowing to a pinprick of light. He didn't hear her enter. He only felt the cooling presence of Amara as she knelt beside him. She didn't offer a platitude. She simply existed there, a grounding force smelling of damp earth and crushed mint, a scent that belonged to a world that didn't care about right angles. Elias leaned his head back against the brick, his chest still heaving. "I cannot allow it to be broken," he whispered, his voice stripped of its precision. "If there is a flaw, it means I have failed." Again. Amara looked at the beam, then back to him. "The land is broken, Mr. Thorne. The creek has moved. The oaks have leaned. Why is that the only kind of honesty you find unacceptable?" Elias let out a ragged laugh that sounded like a sob. The words spilled out, raw, as if the gold resin had finally filled a crack in his resolve. "The conservatory?" he began. "I spent 3 years calculating stress loads to the 4th decimal. I ignored the warnings about the clay soil because I believed that if I were precise enough, I could override the instability of the earth. When the spine snapped, it broke the trust of every patron in the city. I became a ghost before I ever left London." He waited for the pity. Instead, Amara's gaze drifted to the ruins of the estate visible through the open door. "My father was a botanist," she said quietly. "He was cast out of the academy for refusing to falsify his data to suit the Crown's narrative. He died, knowing that the truth was a very lonely place to live. We are both ghosts, Elias. Some of us just have better blueprints for our hauntings." The distance between them vanished. There was no architect and no gardener. There were only two people standing amidst the wreckage of their own expectations. Elias studied his hands, hands that had spent a decade trying to draw a perfect line, and realized they were shaking. He didn't try to hide it. The intimacy was a fragile thing, a thin thread of gold spanning a wide chasm. Elias began to reach out, perhaps to touch her hand or simply to anchor himself, when a violent, metal-sharp crash echoed from the direction of the archives. It was the sound of a heavy door being forced from its hinges, followed by the unmistakable slide of parchment being swept off a table. Both of them froze. The archives were restricted, and Elias held the only key. The intrusion was a violation. As they rushed toward the sound, the silence of the afternoon was replaced by the realization that while they had been learning to live with their breaks, someone had come to ensure the house finally collapsed. Chapter 6. The air in the village archives tasted of wet limestone and the slow, acidic decay of leather bindings. Amara leaned over the mahogany table, her fingers hovering just millimeters above a map of the valley that looked as though it had been drawn by a hand shaking with fever. Beside her, Arjun Mehta was a blur of motion, his glasses sliding perpetually down the bridge of his nose as he flipped through a stack of deeds with a speed that bordered on the violent. The only light came from a single, guttering oil lamp that cast long, skeletal shadows across the rows of shelving, making the thousands of dormant records feel like a crowd of silent witnesses. "It is a mathematical impossibility, Amara, a genuine, exhilarating impossibility." Arjun's voice arrived in a rapid-fire staccato, the words tripping over one another in his haste. He pointed a thin, ink-stained finger at a survey from 1812. "Look here. The eastern boundary of Willowmere is marked by the old creek bed, yet the physical footprint of the ruins, the actual masonry Elias is currently scrubbing, extends 12 feet beyond this line." 12 feet. In the world of land tenure, 12 feet is a kingdom. It is a fortress. It is a scandal. Amara didn't answer immediately. She traced the line of the creek on the map, her mind shifting from the ink to the actual soil of the estate. She could almost feel the damp moss of the eastern wall, the way the ivy clung to the stone like a desperate lover. "Why would the deeds be smaller than the house?" she asked, her voice low, melodic, yet carrying a new edge of sharpness. "One does not simply forget to record a wing of a manor." "Precisely." Arjun beamed, his enthusiasm momentarily overriding his social clumsiness. He reached for a heavy vellum blueprint, its edges curled and yellowed like an old tooth. "Because it wasn't a wing. It was a secret. Look at the layering here." He tilted the vellum toward the lamp. Under the dim light, the thickness of the parchment revealed a discrepancy. There was a faint, ghosted indentation beneath the primary ink, a second set of lines drawn with a lighter hand, perhaps in a different ink that had faded over a century. Amara leaned in, her breath hitching. She focused on the intersection of the library and the East Gallery. There, hidden behind a false wall of architectural notation, lay a small rectangular void, a room without a door on the official plan. A ghost room. Clandestine meetings, Arjun whispered, his tone shifting to one of academic reverence. The Regency era was a theater of propriety, but the backstage was far more interesting. This room was designed for the things one could not say in the drawing room. Lovers, political dissidents, perhaps a disgraced relative. It is a pocket of silence built into the very bone of the house. Amara felt a sudden, electric jolt of clarity. For weeks she had played the role of the gardener, the quiet steward of the wild, reacting to the threats Lady Beatrice Sterling hurled at Elias. She had been a shield, passive and enduring, but as she stared at that hidden rectangle, the passivity vanished. This wasn't just a curiosity of history, it was a legal weapon. If the estate was larger than the deeds claimed, the entire basis of Beatrice's uninhabitable loophole was skewed. The land survey was the foundation of the lien, and the foundation was a lie. He is working on that wall, Amara said, her voice now a steady, cold current. Elias is reinforcing the East Gallery right now. He's hammering brackets into the very masonry that hides this room. Arjun's expression soured, the excitement replaced by a flicker of dread. He adjusted his glasses with a sharp flick of his finger, which makes the timing precarious. If the Sterlings have a copy of these original surveys, or if they've suspected the room's existence, they won't let him find it. They could claim the undocumented land as public domain, or worse, use the discrepancy to argue that the Thorne title is fraudulent. Once a room like this is uncovered, it becomes a race to see who can claim the deed to the air inside it. Amara didn't wait for him to finish. The realization that the house held a secret meant that the house was no longer just a ruin to be saved. It was a puzzle to be solved before someone else stole the pieces. She turned to leave, her skirt sweeping through the dust of the archives, her mind already mapping the distance from the library to the gallery. She could see it in her mind, the heavy oak paneling, the smell of damp lime, the hidden latch that had waited 100 years to be pressed. She stepped out of the archive building and into the cool gray air of the village, her pace hurried. But as she turned the corner toward the main road, she stopped dead. Standing before the heavy iron gates of the archives was the village magistrate, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from a particularly sour turnip. He was flanked by 2 constables. Beside them, the door to the archives was shut tight, and the heavy iron bolt had been slid into place. "The archives are closed by order of the magistrate, Miss Okoro," the man said, his voice thin and devoid of warmth. "A matter of municipal auditing. No one enters or leaves until the records have been verified." Amara's heart didn't hammer, it went cold, a heavy stone settling in her gut. She looked past the magistrate toward the distant silhouette of Willowmere on the hill. There, idling at the very edge of the estate's perimeter, was a polished black carriage. The lacquer gleamed like a raven's wing in the fading light. Even from this distance, she could see the silhouette of a woman sitting upright in the window, a fan likely tapping against a wrist in a slow, rhythmic cadence of victory. Lady Beatrice Sterling had not waited for the archives to open. She had simply closed them. Amara stood frozen on the cobblestones, the map in her mind suddenly feeling like a trap. She had found the ghost room, but she had found it too late. The predator was already in the garden, and Elias, obsessed with his straight lines and perfect brackets, was hammering away at the very wall that held the key to his salvation, unaware that he was sealing himself into a corner from which there was no architectural escape. Chapter 7. The champagne was lukewarm, and the conversation was worse. Elias stood on the manicured lawn of the Sterling estate, his spine a rigid line of architectural precision that felt, for the first time, like a structural flaw. He wore a coat of midnight wool that fit with mathematical exactitude, yet he felt as though he were wearing a costume for a play in which he had forgotten the lines. Around him, the ton moved in a synchronized ballet of silk and hypocrisy, their laughter ringing out in high, brittle notes that reminded him of glass under too much tension. "And tell us, Mr. Thorne," a banker named Holloway asked, leaning in with a smile that stayed cold, "is it true that you are attempting to revive Willowmere? A bold venture, certainly, though some might call it a sentimental folly. One does not usually build upon a foundation of ghosts." Elias adjusted his cufflink, the silver cold against his skin. The foundation is sound, Mr. Holloway. The instability is merely superficial. With the correct bracing and a commitment to the original geometry, the house will be habitable by the equinox." "Habitable," Holloway repeated, the word tasting of amusement. "A quaint ambition. Most men of your standing would simply raze the ruin and start anew. It is far more efficient than scrubbing the damp musk from a century of failure." Before Elias could respond with a technical rebuttal regarding the integrity of the lime mortar, the crowd parted. Lady Beatrice Sterling approached, her presence heralded by the rhythmic, predatory tap of her fan against her wrist. She wore a gown of pale gold that shimmered like a warning. Her smile was a masterpiece of social theater, wide and entirely devoid of warmth. "My dear Elias," she exclaimed, her voice projecting to the furthest reaches of the terrace. "I was just telling the Countess of Salisbury about your bravery. Truly, it is a testament to the human spirit that you persist in fixing that hopeless ruin. To spend one's days amidst the rubble of a fallen house, it is almost romantic, in a tragic, ruined sort of way, like a man trying to teach a dead bird to sing." Elias felt the heat climb his neck. The guests chuckled, a soft collective sound that felt like 1,000 small needles. He wanted to tell her that the house was not a ruin, but a dormant organism, that the decay was merely a veil. Instead, he remained frozen, the rigid etiquette of the afternoon acting as a corset, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Nearby, Zoya Volkov fluttered like a pale moth, drifting from one group to another. She leaned toward a cluster of young debutantes, her voice a high, airy whisper that nevertheless carried. "It is a wonder he finds the strength," Zoya murmured, glancing toward Elias. "I hear he spends his hours in the dirt with the staff. Such a peculiar friendship, don't you think? One wonders if the isolation of Willowmere has affected his sensibilities. It is a very lonely place for a man of his temperament." Elias closed his eyes for a second. The air was thick with the scent of overly manicured roses and expensive powder, a cloying sweetness that felt suffocating. He looked across the lawn and saw her. Amara stood at the periphery, near the edge of the boxwood hedges. She was not dressed for a party. She wore a simple dress of deep forest green, her hair unbound and catching the light. She looked like a piece of the wild world that had accidentally wandered into a museum of waxworks. She didn't wave or smile, she simply watched him, her gaze steady and knowing. Suddenly, the geometry of the afternoon shifted. The banker was still speaking, something about interest rates and land yields, but the words became a distant hum. Elias felt a surge of sudden, violent repulsion. He watched the polished shoes, the forced smiles, and the strategic pauses of Lady Beatrice, and he realized that this social redemption he had spent years craving was a hollow prize. He was fighting to be accepted by people who viewed a house as a ledger and a soul as a social asset. The rigid lines of the ton were not a structure to be admired. They were a cage. Without a word of apology to Holloway, Elias turned and walked away. He didn't glide or drift, he marched, his boots cutting a straight path through the sea of silk. He ignored the confused glances and the sudden silence that trailed in his wake. He navigated the perimeter of the party, slipping past the champagne towers and the tiered cakes, until the noise of the crowd faded into the rustle of leaves. He found her in the shadows of the hedge maze, where the air smelled of damp earth and crushed mint. Amara was leaning against a pillar of ivy, her presence a cool shadow in the afternoon heat. As he approached, the tension that had held his shoulders high for 3 hours finally snapped. "You look miserable," she said, her voice low and melodic, a sharp contrast to the shrillness of the terrace. "I feel as though I am being audited by a committee of vultures," Elias replied, his voice clipped but lacking its usual edge. He stopped inches from her, the space between them electric and unstable. "They speak of the house as if it were a corpse. They speak of me as if I am the undertaker." Amara reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his coat. "And are you?" "No," he whispered. "I am the one trying to wake it up." He studied her, really looked at her, and saw the soil beneath her fingernails and the fierce protective light in her eyes. In that moment, the distance between the architect and the gardener vanished. Elias did not think of the equinox, or the lean, or the eyes of the society he had just abandoned. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of defiance and desperation. It was not a polite kiss. It was a collision. It was the sound of a wall collapsing and a garden blooming all at once. For Elias, it was a total surrender of control. He stopped trying to measure the moment and simply existed within it. The world narrowed to the scent of her skin and the warmth of her breath against his lips. In the silence of the greenery, the social order of the Regency world felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. He realized he no longer wanted the applause of the ballroom. He wanted the truth of the ruins. They pulled apart slowly, their foreheads resting against one another, breaths hitching in the quiet. The world felt rearranged, the colors of the leaves more vivid, the air lighter. Elias felt a sense of clarity that no blueprint had ever provided. Then, a movement caught the corner of his eye. Behind the limestone pillar of the maze's entrance, a sliver of white fabric was visible, a lace cuff, a glimpse of a pale shoulder. The fabric shifted, then vanished back into the shadows. Elias froze, his heart slowing to a heavy, rhythmic thud. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. Zoya Volkov had not been fluttering among the guests. She had been hunting. And she had just found exactly what she needed to destroy him. Chapter 8. The courier did not knock, he hammered. The sound fractured the dawn, sending starlings screaming from the eaves of Willowmere. Elias was already awake, hunched over a drafting table in the morning gloom, the ink on his latest sketch still wet. The door swung open, and a man in soot-stained livery stepped into the foyer holding a wax-sealed envelope with the precision of a death warrant. Elias took the parchment, his fingers tracing the heavy seal of the High Court. As he read, the air seemed to thin. It was a surgical strike. Lady Beatrice Sterling had not waited for the equinox. Using a combination of the uninhabitable clause and sworn affidavits regarding structural instability, likely penned by Zoya Volkov, Beatrice had secured an immediate injunction. All restoration work was frozen. The estate was to be placed in probate pending a seizure hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. "This is a lie," Elias whispered. He had focused so intently on the mathematics of the walls that he had forgotten the mathematics of malice. Beatrice hadn't played a game of architecture, she had played a game of leverage, and he had handed her the fulcrum. Amara appeared in the doorway, her boots caked in river silt, a bundle of wild mint in her arms. She didn't need to see the document to know the house felt brittle. "The courier looked as though he were delivering a plague," she said. "Worse," Elias replied. "She's frozen the site. If I cannot produce the expanded deed, the original grant that exempts the ruins from the habitability clause, the court will grant her the seizure by noon tomorrow." The expanded deed. "You said it was locked in the ghost room." "It is," Elias said, already moving toward the east wing. "The archives in town are incomplete. That room is the only place where the legal soul of Willowmere still exists." They ran through the corridors, the house feeling less like a project and more like a labyrinth closing in. The east wing was a skeletal stretch of limestone and rotting oak. As they rounded the final corner, a subterranean groan echoed through the floorboards. They stopped dead. A cloud of white limestone dust drifted through the air like powdered bone. Where the door to the ghost room should have been, there was only a wall of jagged rubble. The heavy rains had finally won, the ceiling had succumbed, burying the entrance under a mountain of gray stone and splintered beams. Elias stepped forward, his hand touching the debris. He felt a hollow vacuum in his chest. The blueprints in his mind were useless. He had treated the house as a puzzle to be solved with a ruler and compass, ignoring the grinding appetite of the soil. "I can't get in," he whispered, sinking to his knees. He felt the absurdity of his obsession, the way he had chased a phantom of perfection while the foundation slid into the lake. "Get up, Elias," Amara said, kneeling beside him. Her touch was the only thing that felt solid. "The house isn't gone. Only the door is." "It's a wall of stone, Amara. I can't move a mountain by tomorrow." "Perhaps not alone," a voice interrupted. Arjun Mehta stood at the end of the hall in a tweed coat 2 sizes too large, clutching a leather bag of tools. He was breathing hard, as if he had run from the village library. "I heard the courier's horse," Arjun panted. "I suspected Beatrice would move. I've studied the subterranean drainage of the east wing. There is a ventilation shaft, a narrow, forgotten conduit that leads from the cellar directly beneath the ghost room's floorboards. It's tight and filthy, but it's a path." Elias looked from Arjun to the rubble. "You would risk coming down here? Now?" "The history of this house is more important than my laundry," Arjun replied. "We tunnel, or we let a woman who views beauty as a line item on a ledger steal this place." For the next 12 hours, the three became a machine of singular purpose. They descended into the damp smelling of saltpeter and musk. Arjun led with excavation tools, while Elias and Amara hauled out sludge and shifted stones in a feverish rhythm. As the hours bled into the deep night, exhaustion stripped away Elias's defenses. He watched Amara, her face smeared with grime, her resolve unwavering. She wasn't fighting for a title, she was fighting for the soul of the place. "If we lose it," Elias said, leaning against the cold cellar wall, "I can't go back to being the man who only knows how to build things that fall apart." Amara stopped digging. The dim lantern light cast long shadows across her features. "You aren't that man anymore, Elias. That man wouldn't be lying in the mud for a house he doesn't even technically own yet." Elias reached out, brushing dirt from her cheek. "I realized something today. I would rather lose every stone of Willowmere than lose the person who taught me how to see the ruins." Amara leaned her forehead against his, a silent pact made in the dark. The intimacy was sharp and desperate, underscored by the knowledge that their time was evaporating. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cellar grates, a new sound arrived. It was the low, guttural thrum of an engine, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the soil. The demolition crew had arrived early, spurred by Beatrice's eagerness to clear the eyesore before the hearing. "They're here," Arjun gasped. He threw his weight into one final desperate shove with the iron pry bar. There was a sickening crack, and Arjun's hand punched through the ceiling of the conduit, breaking into the void of the ghost room. He let out a triumphant shout, but it was cut short. Above them, there was a sudden, grinding roar of shifting masonry. A heavy slab of limestone, dislodged by the vibration of the engines outside, crashed down. Arjun screamed as the ceiling collapsed further, pinning his arm beneath a jagged piece of the house he had tried so hard to save. Chapter 9. The limestone slab had pinned Arjun's arm with the indifferent weight of a century. The air in the cellar was a caustic soup of pulverized mortar and ancient dust. Elias didn't think. He lunged, sliding through the sludge of the conduit and diving into the jagged maw of the ghost room. The space was a skeletal ribcage of beams and broken slate, shivering with every guttural roar of the machinery on the surface. Above him, the ceiling groaned, a deep wooden ache. "Get out, Elias." Amara's voice was a raw edge. She strained against the slab, her face a mask of grime. "The vibration, the whole wing is shifting." Elias ignored her, scanning the void. There, wedged between a fallen joist and rotting velvet drapery, lay the vellum cylinder. He scrambled forward, the dust coating his throat like powdered glass. As his fingers tightened on the parchment, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. Plaster rained down, blinding him. He pivoted, clutching the document to his chest, and threw himself backward just as a secondary support beam gave way with a sound like a gunshot. He tumbled back into the conduit, colliding with Amara and Arjun in a tangle of limbs and filth. In the sudden silence, they lay heaving. Elias looked at the deed, then at Arjun, whose face was ghostly pale, but whose eyes were wide with triumph. "You have it," Arjun rasped. "The expanded deed, the land, the boundaries, it's all there." Elias stood slowly, draped in a shroud of gray dust, his fine linen shirt ruined. He looked less like an architect and more like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. He reached out to Amara, anchoring himself to her presence. "We have to go up," he said. "Now." They emerged from the cellar hatch into a scene of calculated theater. The morning air smelled of damp earth and idling engines. A small assembly had gathered on the lawn, village elite, members of the ton, and magistrates in official robes. At the center stood Lady Beatrice Sterling, a vision of ivory silk and strategic cruelty, her fan tapping a predatory beat against her wrist. "The grace period has expired," Beatrice declared, her voice carrying with theatrical clarity. She studied the magistrates. "As the residence remains uninhabitable and the owner unable to produce a valid claim to the expanded acreage, I move for the immediate seizure of the land. It is a mercy to replace this eyesore with something of actual utility." Zoya Volkov stood behind her, a triumphant smile on her lips. She leaned toward a neighbor, her voice a high, airy whisper. "Quite a tragedy, though one hardly expects a man of such volatile reputation to manage in the state." Elias stepped forward. The sound of his boots on the gravel was a jarring intrusion. The crowd shifted, taking in the specter in ruined clothes clutching yellowed parchment. Beatrice's fan stopped. "Elias, I had hoped you would have the decency to depart quietly. To appear before the magistrates in such a state is precisely what we expected." Elias stopped a few feet from her. He studied the deed, then the house, the broken windows and stubborn, beautiful decay. "This document," Elias began, his voice steady, "is the expanded deed. It proves the land is secure, and the lien you attempted to leverage is void. Willowmere remains mine." He didn't hand the paper over immediately. He turned to the crowd, the peers who had excised him the moment his blueprints had failed. For years he had chased the ghost of their approval. For a long time, Elias said, his voice growing louder, I believed a man's value was measured by the precision of his lines and the prestige of his associations. I spent my life building walls to keep the world out, and in doing so I built a prison for myself. He turned toward Amara, who stood at the edge of the group, her hands still stained with soil. I no longer care for the standing I once held in your circles, Elias declared, locking eyes with Beatrice. The prestige of my former career is a husk. I renounce it. I renounce the expectations of a class that values the appearance of a garden over the life of the soil. In a move that sent a shockwave through the ton, Elias took Amara's hand. He laced his fingers through hers, ignoring the audible gasp from Zoya and the rigid posture of the magistrates. Willamere is more than real estate, Elias said. It is a living thing. If this house is to be saved, it requires a steward who understands growth, decay, and the patience of the earth. Amara Okoro is that steward. She is my equal in every regard that matters, and she shall be the primary authority on the restoration of these grounds. Beatrice's mask slipped to reveal a raw fury. This is preposterous. You would throw away your name for a gardener? You are committing social suicide. I find the view from the bottom quite refreshing, Lady Beatrice, Elias replied in a cool whisper. Especially when I am the one holding the deed. He handed the vellum to the head magistrate. After a long minute of examination, the official looked up. The documentation is authentic, the magistrate announced. The claim is valid. The seizure is denied. Beatrice stood frozen, her power neutralized by Elias's total indifference to the weapons she wielded. He had simply stepped out of the cage. As the crowd dispersed, there was no celebration. A heavy, cold silence lingered. The elite drifted away in whispering clusters. They had won the land, but they had stepped outside the boundary of the world they knew. Amara squeezed his hand. She didn't smile. You've made yourself a pariah, she whispered. Elias looked at the ruins, then back at her. I've never felt more at home. But as they turned toward the house, Elias noticed a figure lingering by the gate. Zoya Volkov was not leaving. She watched them, eyes narrow, clutching a small, leather-bound notebook to her chest. The look on her face suggested that while the legal battle was over, the war for their reputation had only just begun. Chapter 10. The rhythmic thud of a mallet against a wooden peg echoed through the main hall, no longer the frantic sound of a man fighting a deadline, but the steady heartbeat of a house coming back to life. Elias stood in the center of the atrium, his boots coated in a fine layer of limestone dust that had become a permanent fixture of his wardrobe. He watched the way the light slanted through the restored clerestory windows, illuminating the air in thick golden shafts. Beside him, Amara was guiding a small army of volunteers, locals from the village who had once looked at Willamere as a tomb, as they carefully moved potted ferns into the alcoves. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh cedar, and the sharp, sharp tang of the gold resin that now traced the fractures in the overhead beams. Elias reached up, his finger tracing the jagged line of a repair on the primary support. He did not try to smooth it over or hide the seam. Instead, he felt the slight ridge of the resin, the gold shimmering like a vein of ore in a mountain. It was the mark of Hiroshi's influence, the physical manifestation of wabi-sabi. He remembered the early days of his return, when he would have spent a week sanding that beam into an invisible perfection, erasing the history of its collapse. Now, the scar was the most honest thing in the room. It told the story of the break and the mend, a narrative of survival that no blueprint could ever dictate. You are staring at the ceiling again, Amara said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to ground the cavernous space. She stepped toward him, her dress of practical linen that was stained with the honest green of crushed stems. She didn't tuck her hair behind her ear this time. She let it fall, a wild curtain that mirrored the state of the grounds outside. Are you checking for structural failure, or are you actually seeing it? Elias lowered his hand and slid it into his pocket, a gesture of ease that would have been unthinkable 6 months prior. He didn't reach for his cufflinks. I am seeing the tension, he replied. The way the weight is distributed across the imperfections. It is far more stable than the original design. The original design assumed the world was static. This design accepts that the house will move. Amara smiled, a slow, private thing. Like the gardens, the boxwoods are no longer fighting the ivy. They have reached a sort of truce. She led him toward the great doors, which swung open to reveal the transition from stone to soil. The estate was no longer a battleground between the manicured and the feral. The architectural lines of the terraces remained, providing a skeletal grace, but the growth had been allowed to spill over the edges. Wisteria climbed the pillars in heavy, fragrant clusters, and the paths were paved with a mixture of crushed slate and moss, creating a soft, breathing carpet beneath their feet. It was a blend of intent and accident, a symphony where the conductor had finally decided to let the musicians improvise. Near the east wing, Arjun was meticulously arranging a series of leather-bound ledgers on a mahogany table. He looked up, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and beamed with an intensity that bordered on the monic. "The ghost room is officially an archive," he announced, his words tripping over one another in his haste. "I've catalogued the original 18th century surveys, and I've found a series of letters from the first architect that suggest the lakefront foundations were always meant to be porous. He wanted the house to breathe with the water. He was a visionary, Elias. Absolutely mad, but a visionary." Elias looked at Arjun, the man who had risked everything to provide the blueprints that saved the estate, and felt a surge of genuine affection. The archive was no longer a secret hoard of papers. It was the memory of Willowmere, open to those who cared for the truth of the place. The ghost room had been stripped of its haunting silence and filled with the rustle of parchment and the scent of old ink. It was the intellectual anchor of the house, ensuring that the restoration was not merely a cosmetic exercise, but a conversation with the past. At the edge of the driveway, a small carriage waited. Hiroshi Tanaka stood beside it, his posture as straight and deliberate as a temple pillar. He carried very little, a small chest of tools and a single rolled scroll. He had not spoken much during the final weeks of the project, preferring to let the wood speak for itself. As Elias approached, the old craftsman tilted his head, surveying the house, then the gardens, and finally the man standing before him. "The joinery is tight," Hiroshi said softly, "but the spirit is loose. That is the correct balance." "I still find myself wanting to measure the distance between the columns," Elias admitted, a wry smile touching his lips. "The urge to quantify the beauty is a hard habit to break." Hiroshi nodded slowly, a rhythmic movement of approval. "The map is not the territory, Mr. Thorne. You have stopped drawing the map and started walking the land. That is the only restoration that matters." With a final sharp nod, Hiroshi entered the carriage. As it pulled away, Elias felt a strange sense of completion. The mentor had not left him with a set of rules, but with the permission to be imperfect. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the village to settle the final accounts with the local suppliers, Elias noticed a figure standing in the shadow of the bakery's awning. Zoya Volkov was there, but the fluttering energy she once possessed had vanished. She was dressed in a gown that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, the lace fraying at the cuffs. She clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes darting toward the villagers who passed her by. They didn't whisper about Elias anymore. They didn't gossip about the scandal of the gardener. Instead, they looked through her. Zoya had bet everything on the fall of the Thorne legacy and the victory of Lady Beatrice. Now that the house stood as a testament to a new kind of nobility, one based on authenticity rather than bloodline, Zoya had become a relic of a dead regime. She was a ghost in a town that had decided to wake up. Elias didn't stop to speak to her. There was no triumph in his stride, only a quiet indifference. He had spent his life fearing the judgment of people like Zoya, believing that his value was a sum of his accolades and his adherence to a rigid social code. But as he turned back toward the estate, he realized that the cage had not just been opened, it had been dismantled and used for firewood. As the sun began to dip, casting long, violet shadows across the lawn, Elias and Amara found themselves at the hidden garden path, the place where their hostility had first begun to dissolve into something more electric. The path was narrow, flanked by wild foxgloves and the heavy scent of damp pine. They stopped at a small, clear patch of earth near the base of an ancient oak, where the soil was dark and rich. Amara reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small, weathered packet of seeds. "These are rare hybrids," she whispered. "They require a kind of instability to thrive. They won't grow in a curated bed. They need the wind and the unpredictability of the wild." Elias knelt beside her, the damp earth soaking into the knees of his trousers. He didn't mind. He reached out, his hand covering hers as they pressed the seeds into the loam together. The touch was no longer a spark of friction, but a steady warmth, a shared breath. "No blueprints for this," Elias murmured, his voice rough. "None at all," Amara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We will simply let it grow and see what it becomes." They stayed there in the deepening twilight, two broken things that had found a way to fit together, standing in a house that was finally whole because it had stopped trying to be perfect.